Hello, everyone. I'm Laura Lange, and I am a newer volunteer with CCL. I have a particular interest in how we can connect with those in agriculture, and how we can connect with them to chart our course for a livable future. So I'm very happy all of you have joined us for this 30-minute session to do just that. We have two wonderful speakers with us today, University of Delaware Environmental Engineering Professor, Dr. Holly Michael, and local farmer Amanda Cather, who will introduce themselves shortly. Please note, we will be taking a few questions at the end of the session, so please direct any questions you'd like to ask to our speakers to Marty Hopkins, who is our Ask Me Q&A person for the session. Also, if you have any technical issues, please direct them to Zoom host Mary. So let's get to it. Dr. Holly Michael, could you briefly introduce yourself?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, this wasn't letting me unmute. Now I'm unmuted. Thank you for the introduction, Laura, and thanks for the invitation to be here. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So I'm Holly Michael. I am the director of the Delaware Environmental Institute at the University of Delaware, and I'm also a professor in earth sciences and in civil and environmental engineering. I'm a hydrogeologist. I study primarily water resources and in particular coastal water resources.
Thank you for that introduction. We also have Amanda Cather here. She has made time to join us during lambing season, which we greatly appreciate. Could you introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. My name is Amanda Cather, and I am the owner and operator with my husband of Plow and Stars Farm. We're here in Montgomery County's Agricultural Reserve. I am also the founding director of the Million Acre Challenge, which is a collaborative effort to advance soil health and regenerative agriculture in Maryland on 1 million acres over the next 10 years. And I am the Mid-Atlantic Program Manager for the American Farmland Trust. And I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you both for that. And thanks both for being here. Now we're going to spend a little more time learning about each of our speakers' organizations and work. Amanda, could you kick us off?
Sure.
Hopefully Mary can present the slides that you have for us.
Yeah, I apologize that my presenting doesn't seem to be working. Mary, do you have those?
Yes, I do.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very, very much. So whenever you want to show them, please go ahead. These slides are a little bit about the Million Acre Challenge, and the Million Acre Challenge is founded to help agriculture become a part of the solution to climate change. Everyone knows, I think, that agriculture, the industry, is just a huge contributor to climate change, not only actual farms, but also all of the ancillary industries that go along with it. So the Million Acre Challenge goal is really to help agriculture become a part of the solution. And we go about that in a number of ways. We have 6 different angles on the ways to help agriculture become a part of the solution. One is science. So we're working with the Pennsylvania Alliance for Sustainable Agriculture on a soil testing and benchmarking project called the Soil Health Benchmark Study and other research. One is farmer-to-farmer networking and peer mentorship and engagement. Farmers learn best from other farmers, so setting up ways in which farmers can learn from one another about strategies for climate smart farming that really also benefit their farms, that help their farms be more resilient in the face of a changing climate and also more profitable over time, in addition to contributing all of these environmental services. That's a huge part of what we do. Farm profitability models, so the business case for regenerative agriculture, connecting with consumers and helping consumers learn how they can impact and advance regenerative agriculture. And finally, policy work, advocacy work at the state level, and in the case of American Farmland Trust, at the national level as well. And finally, our 6th angle is equity. I think that it's pretty clear at this point that agriculture is a particular arena in which diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice has been seriously lacking in our country, and kind of the founding of that industry in our country bears those wounds and still carries those wounds. So looking at the ways that equity can be a critical part of advancing regenerative agriculture is another piece of our work. Next slide, please. This is our mission and vision, Million Acre Challenge. Really seeing regenerative agriculture as going beyond healthy soils, but healthy soils as the foundation of regenerative agriculture. There is not an official definition of regenerative agriculture. We really see it as farming that contributes to improved ecological, social, and economic outcomes. And our vision is enhanced soil and ecosystem health and increased farm profitability on at least 1 million agricultural acres in Maryland by 2030. Next slide, please. This is our founding team, the 6 organizations that originally started the Million Acre Challenge: Future Harvest, Chesapeake Bay Foundation, Fair Farms, the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research, the Hatcher Group, and the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. And each of these organizations takes the lead on a different part of the project. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, there you go. And this is just a summary slide. You can see we are on Facebook, we're on Twitter, we're on LinkedIn, we're on Instagram. We are having farmer focused, for the most part, events all of the time, both virtual and in person. But it's worth following Million Acre Challenge to kind of learn more about what we're up to. That's just a brief introduction to the work that I do and the ways in which we think agriculture in Maryland and beyond can become a part of the climate change solution. Thanks again, Mary.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. Thank you, Amanda. Thanks for telling us about all the great work Million Acre Challenge is doing to promote regenerative agriculture and healthy soils. So now let's hear from Holly. I think she's got her own slides. So
yes.
I think you might be muted still.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Let me just make this full screen. Can you see that? Okay.
Yes.
So, so I mentioned I'm the director of the Delaware Environmental Institute, and as part of that institute, we have several large research projects, many of which, maybe all of which, actually link to climate change. And 2 in particular, we have a coastal critical zone network and an EPSCoR project called Project Wicked, Water and the Changing Coastal Environment of Delaware. Both of these projects are funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation. And in these 2 projects in particular, we're looking at the problem of salinization of agricultural soils and water in coastal zones. And these are large collaborations among several different institutions. And so I should say off the bat, I'm a hydrologist. I'm not an agronomist. I'm not an expert in agriculture, but I was asked to talk a little bit about this issue of saltwater intrusion and how it can affect how saltwater intrusion due to climate change can affect agriculture. So I'll just give a brief overview, and hopefully that can serve as a basis for our discussion. So thinking about water resources in coastal zones, I think about water, and especially groundwater, as being squeezed between the land and the sea. And so this is depicted in this sketch, where this light blue, so this is sort of a cross section underground. The light blue is freshwater. The gray represents saline groundwater, which is always under the sea. And so the sea is essentially a huge source of contamination, and that salt water, as shown by the red arrows, can move inland. It can get into our wells. It can flood the land surface and get into our groundwater. And then, of course, there are the other pressures on our water resources, like contaminants from industry and municipalities, and excess nutrients, et cetera. So some mechanisms that the salt can get into our water, and the role of climate change in that are depicted on the right here. So you can think of water at the coast as being sort of a seesaw. There's a balance between the land and sea that determines where the salt water is. So in these cross sections on the right, this is meant to be fresh groundwater under land and salty groundwater under the ocean. And so if you upset that balance, if you reduce rainfall, for example, or if sea level rises, you upset that balance and that salt can move inland. And of course, with sea level rise and also with ocean surges, that salt water goes over the land and also infiltrates down into our soils and then into our water. So the land sea balance is upset with climate change, coastlines are migrating inland, and storms are also increasing in frequency and intensity. So that's causing more of these surges that go further inland, and also water tables can rise. You only need 1% of salt water to ruin a freshwater resource. So just a little bit of salt mixes in with our water and causes lots of problems, not only to our water supply, but of course to our ecosystems. And so one thing that's been coming up more and more in the media and seems to be becoming more of an issue is saltwater intrusion into farmland. And so I picked out a few articles on this, many along the Delmarva, but also this Washington Post article for North Carolina. And the effects are, of course, of salt. We have ag land right up against saltwater bodies, but also because of rising water tables. As sea level rises, even the freshwater table moves up. This is a local problem, but it's also a global problem. So this map shows farmland in red and yellow, and the red is coastal farmland. And there are studies from all over the world that highlight these problems of saltwater intrusion with sea level rise and changes in climate. So in our work, we are interested in particular in this process. So the farms that we're studying are adjacent to salt marshes. And what I'm illustrating here is where you would normally have a high tide. So the marsh approximately goes up to the average high tide mark. Occasionally we get some surge tides that might run up onto the agricultural fields and cause salinization of the soil, eventually flushing out. So with climate change, we have an increase in the average high tide and an increase, therefore, in the surge tide, and that's becoming more frequent and even higher with climate change. So what we're seeing is that in many areas, the fields right next to the salt marsh are becoming unusable. So and another potential issue is salinization of the irrigation water. So if you're pumping and as sea level rises, this salt water can move underground, potentially causing problems with our irrigation. So that's what we're studying. We're doing research to try and understand the problem, its scope, the physics of it, but also understanding the economics and the social feedbacks in order to really predict future scenarios of this coupled human natural system. We do a lot of monitoring of water levels, salinity. We're concerned about release of contaminants when water levels rise and salt is introduced into the system. You can release nutrients, you can release metals, et cetera. And we're trying to develop solutions, and I think I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but we can have engineering solutions, but when we're thinking about feedbacks with climate change, better solutions are more green, right? Allowing marshes to migrate or creating green infrastructure that mitigates the flooding. And also we hope to help to develop science-based policies. So I'll stop there and I look forward to a discussion.
Great, thank you. It's interesting to learn about the issues that rising sea levels can have on agriculture. So now that we have a little bit of background, I'd like to ask you both a few questions. First of all, what kind of benefits do healthy soils provide in terms of climate change mitigation? Amanda, I'll direct this one to you first.
So I think, Laura, that I think that the jury is still out on exactly the benefits, the carbon sequestration benefits of healthy soils practices. Where we are not uncertain is that healthy soils can really contribute to greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So, and have a host of other benefits. So there is some research that indicates that there are healthy soils practices that can sequester carbon. Those can include keeping the soil covered. They can include minimizing disturbance. These are, whether that's biological disturbance, whether that's chemical disturbance, whether that's physical disturbance, keeping a living root in the ground, so perennial systems as much as possible, and soil armor. So well, keeping the soil covered, the living root, minimizing disturbance, and then keeping that soil. Keeping that perennial system as much as possible. So the way that those principles get applied on different farms looks very different. So there is no one prescriptive set of practices that we can say, these are the healthy soils practices that are good for your particular farm. And that's why it's so important to recognize that regenerative agriculture and soil health is not a prescription. It's more of a menu that farms can kind of choose from and select from for their own appropriate production system. What's really, and so I think that there is a lot of research that suggests that some of these practices do sequester carbon over the long term. Some of them, for example, cover cropping, again, perennial systems, pasture-based livestock production, reduction of inputs, including fertilizer and pesticides. All of those can contribute to greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And at the same time, building healthy soils, that becomes a positive feedback loop where the biology in the soil is healthier, so you don't need to apply as many outside inputs. Your pastures are more productive. So they contribute to water quality improvements, to biodiversity improvements. So they have a host of benefits as well as greenhouse gas emissions reductions. Hopefully, we will have really good hard research to indicate that those practices also contribute to climate change mitigation as well. You want to add anything, Holly?
Oh, that was great. I would just add, I was going to say, in part the same thing, that healthy soils contribute to healthy ecosystems, and the healthy ecosystems are going to sequester carbon. And another aspect of it is flood mitigation. So, thinking about coastal farmland, if we have healthy marshes and healthy fields, then that vegetation is going to mitigate the flood problem. And also healthy marshes in particular are going to they're going to trap sediments, which means that they're going to rise with rising sea level. And so to the extent that we can keep those marshes healthy and growing, rising with the rising sea level, then that's going to protect our farmland too.
Great, thank you for going into detail on that one. It's exciting to hear about it, but it's also interesting to see how much is uncertain right now. But also along that line, considering the rising sea levels, I think you started to touch on this a little bit, Holly, already. Considering the rising sea levels impacting or soon to be impacting our region, what kind of adaptations might farmers have to consider to maintain their healthy soils and profitability? What kind of insights do you have there?
Yeah, so I mentioned engineering solutions, which could always build something to keep the floodwaters out, right? But even if you do that, the saltwater can intrude underground. One of our farms where we work, we were seeing there was an irrigation pond, and we were seeing salinization of that pond, which is actually connected to a tidal creek as sea levels, rising more and more. And so a fairly simple solution there was to install a one-way valve. So, there are engineering solutions, but as I mentioned, I think it's really important to think about green solutions to these problems. And one of which could be, so in the farms where we work, some of them where you can no longer grow the crops, it's just mowed. And so one simple thing might be to allow the marshes to migrate into that zone, which is, currently kept clear, because the marsh actually, as I said, is somewhat of a barrier to flooding, and also allows for sediment accretion. And the great benefit of that is that marshes sequester more carbon per unit area than basically any ecosystem on Earth. And so by adding some area of marsh, we're reducing that positive feedback with climate change. So, Amanda, do you have thoughts?
I can't speak as much to sea level rise for sure, but in terms of some of the other impacts of climate change, if farmers are really on the front lines in terms of seeing the extreme weather impacts, whether it's warmer nights or more intense rainfall, or long periods without rainfall, and luckily, healthy soils really help mitigate all of the impacts that farmers see for climate change because of the improved water dynamics, whether it's holding water in dry seasons or allowing water to filter through in wet seasons, whether it's, the kind of sustained production. So production over time being more consistent, rather than, you may not have the highs and lows that your neighbor has in terms of production with healthier soils. And I would add also, along the same lines as Holly said, the more you think of your farm as an ecosystem, and in addition to infield practices, focus on those edge of field practices, whether it's riparian buffers or hedgerows or filter strips, the installations on your farm that both bring biodiversity, help filter water. Those also are perennial systems, so they will help sequester carbon. All of those installations will help mitigate the impacts of climate change on the farm as well.
Thank you both for going into details on what the options might be and how healthy soils can help protect the farms. So against the issues of climate change. One other thing I'd like to add, or also like to note, that if anyone in the audience is interested in learning more about which regional areas might be impacted by sea level rise, I highly recommend joining the En-ROAD session that starts at 3:05. But so now that we know a lot more about the mitigation potential of healthy soils and the threat of saltwater intrusion for our local farmers, I'd like to focus a little more on what we can do to support farmers in the mid-Atlantic. So I'd like to ask you both, starting with Amanda, what kind of actions can our audience members take if they'd like to get more involved with promoting healthy soils and connecting in agriculture in our region?
So I think, it's a Wendell Berry quote that eating is an agricultural act. So all of you are already engaged with agriculture in our region, and I'm grateful for that. And I'm sure that all of you are extremely conscious consumers. But that, I'd say, there's kind of two angles to the ways that people can make the most impact. And one is obviously with their dollars, with their food dollars. And while it's not always the case automatically that local food has a lower carbon footprint, except by virtue of the distance, the shorter distance that it travels, certainly by buying local, you can have an impact by having the relationship with the farmer that produces your food. So I always think that local purchasing whenever you can is important. I'm a livestock farmer. I don't eat meat that I don't grow or that I don't know who grew it. So I know that there is a huge debate right now over meat and the future of meat in our diets. I just think, I'd just say very simply, being conscious about the way in which you eat meat is important. And I'll not take it any farther than that. I think that there are also corporations who are involved in the agricultural supply chain, who are trying very hard to be conscious about their corporation's climate impact. So while if you can't purchase everything locally, you can become more informed about which corporations in the agricultural supply chain are actually making an effort to reduce, not just by offsetting their carbon emissions, but by actually having an impact on their entire supply chain, which includes farm viability, which includes the profitability of the farms that they're purchasing from, and helping those farmers be successful and flourish, and the agricultural communities that those farms support be successful and flourish. So that's the consumer side. And I would also say on the policy side, when we were talking about this in our preparation for this session, Marty was very passionate and correct about the fact that we need to create policies that are going to work for farmers in order to help them farm in a way that is beneficial to the climate. So it's very easy to say, you should do this, you should do this. Why don't farmers do this? Why don't farmers just implement these practices? And the reason they don't is the same reason that all of us aren't, eating the perfect diet and exercising every day, in addition to all of the other things that we have to do. Farmers are running a business, and every day we are trying to support ourselves. We are trying to keep our business running, and we are trying to be good stewards of the land and leave a legacy for our families of an improved environment, a thriving business, and a community that we are supporting and supports us. So when you think about policy, try to think about, again, policies that help farmers flourish and policies that help agricultural communities flourish, whether they're urban or rural. That being said, the Farm Bill 23 is coming up really quickly, and that the work on that is happening now. And that is a way, influencing the Farm Bill and the USDA programs that it supports. That is a way that we can have a real impact on making agriculture part of the solution. So the National Sustainable Agriculture Council and American Farmland Trust are both going to be working on federal policy recommendations for the Farm Bill. And I would say follow those conversations, get involved in those conversations. You really can have an impact.
Great, thank you. Holly,
fantastic. I have very little to add, except that, to advocate for for more research to understand the problems and to be able to predict it, so that we have real science-based policy that also is benefiting the farmers.
100%. Yes, we need more research. Very, very much. Yeah.
Amanda, I have just a follow-on question. So are there, how can we develop, relationships with our local farms and understand, like you said, you won't eat meat except if you've grown it or who has, so how do we build those relationships, and are there, is there information available on larger companies and their practices and things like that?
Yeah, I think I've had really interesting conversations as part of Green America. They have some really interesting, Open Team has some really interesting companies that are working hard in the agricultural realm. So I'm trying to think of other resources, and if I do those kind of lists, and some of them are surprising, and you might not expect. Folks are trying. They are trying. Some definitely have, centuries of amends to make. Let's put it that way. But I think we can give one another some grace and try to support the efforts that they're making. In terms of connecting with local farmers, your farmers market, your CSA. I have run CSA programs for many years, and for me, that's the most powerful way that I connect with consumers, because I have a conversation with them every week. What are we doing? How are we doing it? Why are we doing it that way? And that, what would they like us to do differently? And the dialogue that we can have there is extremely powerful. So I would recommend that if you can, if it works for your family and your budget, that can be an extremely good way to connect with farmers and impact them.
Thanks.
Thank you. I know Marty was checking the Q&A, but I don't know if we have enough time to answer any questions. Are there any super quick ones, Marty?
Yeah, there's one that's quick and it's kind of appropriate. Amanda, as a livestock farmer, the question is that livestock produces a significant amount of methane. Is there a way to reduce this or is it just a matter of eating less meat, or is there a way to change diet or something like that might help?
Yeah, this is an area where we need to do more research, right? It does seem like there are feed additives that could potentially reduce methane. I know they're feeding some seaweed to cows and they're seeing a reduction that way, but of course, then you get into seaweed issues. I think that the short answer is we really do need to eat less, and we need it to be raised on pasture, because we can, pastured meat is definitely more environmentally friendly meat, and more humane. So we need it to be pastured, we need to eat less, and we need to continue doing research on how we can reduce the impacts.
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this session. So I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. And in particular, I'd like to thank Amanda and Holly for taking the time to join us and giving us insight into the world of agriculture in the Mid-Atlantic. All right, thank you all so much.
Thanks all of you for your commitment and being here.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you.